Baby discovered a bear cub, trapped in a bike shop storage. What Baby did next wield justice. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight in the small mountain town where Ethan Marshall ran his bike shop with his wife, Jessica Brooks. It was the kind of rain that made everything smell like wet earth and pine needles, the kind that turned the gravel parking lot into a maze of puddles that reflected the gray sky above. Inside Marshall's Cycles, the familiar scent of rubber tires and chain oil created a warm contrast to the dampness outside. The shop had been in Ethan's family for 2 generations, and every corner held memories layered like the dust on the highest shelves. Their daughter Lily, barely 2 years old with curls the color of autumn leaves, toddled around the shop floor while her parents worked on inventory that Tuesday afternoon. She had just learned to walk steadily a few months ago, and now she treated the bike shop like her personal kingdom, weaving between the displays of helmets and the rows of shiny bicycles that towered above her small frame. Jessica was counting brake pads at the front counter when she noticed the unusual silence. Usually, Lily's presence came with a constant soundtrack of babbling, giggling, or the soft patter of her tiny sneakers on the concrete floor. But now there was nothing. Just the steady drum of rain on the metal roof and the occasional whoosh of a car passing on the wet street outside. She looked up from her clipboard, scanning the shop floor for the familiar sight of her daughter's pink overalls. The bicycles stood in their neat rows like silent sentinels, but there was no sign of Lily among them. Jessica felt that particular flutter in her chest that every parent knows. Not quite panic, but the sharp edge of attention that comes when a child goes too quiet for too long. She called out softly at first, not wanting to alarm Ethan, who was in the back office wrestling with quarterly taxes. When there was no response, she called again, louder this time, and heard Ethan's chair scrape against the floor as he stood up. They both began searching, checking behind the counter, in the small bathroom, even in the cardboard boxes that Lily sometimes liked to hide in during their games of peekaboo. It was Ethan who noticed that the door to the storage room was slightly ajar, just a crack really, but enough for a determined toddler to squeeze through. The storage room was off limits to Lily, filled with boxes of inventory, old bike parts, and tools that could be dangerous for small hands. They had told her many times not to go in there, but 2-year-olds have a way of forgetting rules when curiosity takes hold. The storage room stretched back into shadows, lit only by a single bulb that cast long shapes across the concrete floor. Boxes were stacked to the ceiling in some places, creating narrow pathways that wound through the space like a maze. Jessica's heart was beating faster now as she and Ethan moved through the passages, calling Lily's name. The rain seemed louder back here, drumming against the thin walls and the small window high up on the back wall that was streaked with water. They could hear something else, too. A soft sound that wasn't quite crying but wasn't quite talking either. It was Lily's voice, but she was using that special tone she reserved for the neighbor's cat, a gentle sing-song quality that meant she had found something interesting. They found her in the very back corner of the storage room, sitting cross-legged on the cold concrete floor. She wasn't alone. Behind a tumbled stack of tire boxes that had fallen at some point during the previous night's storm, something dark and furry was moving. At first, Ethan thought it might be a large dog that had somehow gotten trapped, but as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he realized with a shock that ran from his scalp to his toes that it was a bear cub. The creature couldn't have been more than a few months old, its fur still fluffy with youth. Its eyes wide and frightened as it pressed itself against the wall. The boxes had created an accidental prison, too heavy for the small animal to move, and too precisely fallen to allow it to squeeze through any gaps. Lily was completely unafraid, reaching her small hand through a gap in the boxes, not quite touching the cub but offering her presence like a gift. She was making soft cooing sounds, the same ones she made when she was trying to comfort her stuffed animals after a particularly rough tea party. The cub, for its part, had stopped trying to escape and was watching the toddler with what looked almost like curiosity. Its small chest rose and fell rapidly with frightened breaths, but it wasn't growling or showing its teeth. Instead, it seemed as confused by the situation as the adults were shocked by it. Jessica's first instinct was to grab Lily and pull her away from danger, but Ethan caught her arm gently. There was something in the scene that made him pause, something in the way the two young creatures were regarding each other that seemed almost sacred. The cub was clearly terrified but not aggressive, and Lily showed no fear at all, only that pure, uncomplicated compassion that young children possess before the world teaches them to be afraid. Still, they needed to get Lily away from the bear and figure out how the animal had gotten into their storage room in the first place. The mystery deepened when Ethan noticed the small window high on the wall was broken. Just a small hole, really, but large enough for a desperate cub to squeeze through if it was motivated enough. The storm must have frightened it, sent it looking for shelter, and the warmth and dryness of the storage room must have seemed like salvation. But now it was trapped. And somewhere out there, a mother bear was probably looking for her baby. The thought sent a chill down Ethan's spine that had nothing to do with the damp air in the storage room. They needed to act carefully and quickly. If you're still watching, please hit that like button as this story is about to take an unexpected turn that will warm your heart. Jessica gently coaxed Lily away from the boxes, bribing her with the promise of the chocolate cookies they kept hidden in the office for special occasions. But Lily kept looking back at the cub, her small face creased with concern. She pointed at the boxes and then at the cub, making a pushing motion with her tiny hands. It took Ethan a moment to understand what she was trying to communicate. She wanted them to move the boxes, to free the trapped animal. The simplicity and clarity of her compassion was stunning, cutting through all the adult concerns about safety and liability and danger. While Jessica took Lily to the front of the shop, Ethan stayed in the storage room, studying the situation. The cub watched him with dark, intelligent eyes, no longer trying to hide, but seemingly understanding that these humans might be its path to freedom. Ethan had grown up in these mountains, had seen bears from a distance many times, but never this close, never this young and vulnerable. He knew he should probably call animal control, let the professionals handle it, but something in him resisted. Maybe it was Lily's innocent insistence, or maybe it was the way the cub looked so small and frightened, but he found himself moving toward the boxes slowly, speaking in low, calm tones. The boxes were heavy, filled with tire tubes and chains, and they had fallen in such a way that moving one might cause others to topple. Ethan worked carefully, conscious of the cub watching his every move. As he shifted the first box, the cub scrambled back, pressing itself into the corner, but it didn't try to attack or even growl. It was as if it understood that Ethan was trying to help, or perhaps it was simply too exhausted and frightened to fight. The rain continued its steady rhythm on the roof, creating a strange sense of peace in the storage room despite the unusual situation. As Ethan worked, he found himself thinking about Lily's reaction to the cub. She had shown no fear, only concern and a desire to help. When had adults learned to respond to the unknown with fear first and compassion second? When had they stopped seeing a frightened baby and started seeing a dangerous wild animal? The cub was potentially dangerous, yes, but in this moment it was simply scared and alone, separated from its mother by the cruelty of circumstance and weather. Ethan moved another box, creating a larger gap, and the cub shifted slightly, its eyes never leaving his face. From the front of the shop, Ethan could hear Lily's voice, high and insistent, and Jessica's calm responses. He knew his wife was probably worried sick but trying not to show it for Lily's sake. Another box moved, and suddenly there was a clear path from the corner to the back door of the storage room. The cub noticed it immediately, its head swiveling toward the opening, but it didn't move. Perhaps it was too frightened, or perhaps it was waiting for some signal that it was safe to leave. Ethan stepped back, giving the animal plenty of space, and waited. The waiting stretched out, filled only with the sound of rain and the distant murmur of voices from the shop. The cub took a tentative step forward, then another, its movements cautious and deliberate. It was smaller than Ethan had first thought, probably only about 20 pounds, its paws still oversized in that way that promised future growth. As it moved into better light, he could see that it was thin, probably hungry, and there was a small cut on its front paw that had already started to heal. This cub had been on its own for at least a day or two, maybe separated from its mother during the storm. Just as the cub reached the pathway between the boxes, Lily appeared in the doorway of the storage room. She had escaped from Jessica somehow, her determination to help the baby bear stronger than her mother's grip. She was carrying something in her small hands, and as she toddled forward, Ethan realized it was her lunch from earlier, a peanut butter sandwich that she had only eaten half of. Before either adult could stop her, she had placed the sandwich on the floor in front of the cub and stepped back, her face bright with satisfaction. The cub sniffed the air, its black nose twitching as it caught the scent of peanut butter. It looked from the sandwich to Lily, then back to the sandwich, as if trying to understand this offering. Slowly, carefully, it crept forward and took the sandwich in its mouth, backing away quickly to eat it in the safety of distance. Lily clapped her hands with delight, and even Ethan found himself smiling despite the surreal nature of the situation. There was something profound happening here, a moment of connection between species that transcended the usual boundaries of wild and domestic. Jessica appeared in the doorway, her face a mixture of concern and wonder as she took in the scene. She held Lily's hand firmly this time, but she didn't pull her away. Together, the family watched as the cub finished the sandwich and looked around as if hoping for more. Its fear seemed to be diminishing, replaced by a cautious curiosity about these strange creatures that had freed it and fed it. Ethan knew they needed to get the cub outside before its mother came looking for it, because a mother bear was a very different situation than a lost cub. The back door of the storage room opened onto a small loading area that backed up to the forest. Ethan moved slowly toward it, aware that the cub was watching him intently. The door was old and squeaky, and as it opened, the sound of rain grew louder and the smell of wet pine filled the room. The cub's head turned toward the opening, and Ethan could see its nostrils flaring as it scented the familiar smells of the forest. Freedom was just a few steps away, but still the cub hesitated, looking back at Lily as if to say goodbye. What happened next would stay with the Marshall family forever. Lily pulled free from Jessica's hand and walked slowly toward the cub, her movements careful and deliberate like she had seen her parents do. She stopped just out of reach and sat down on the concrete floor, crossing her legs in that way that only toddlers can make look comfortable. She didn't try to touch the cub, didn't make any sudden movements, just sat there with her hands in her lap, looking at the young bear with those bright, innocent eyes. The cub took a step toward her, then another, until they were separated by barely a foot of space. For a long moment they simply looked at each other, two young creatures at the beginning of their respective journeys through life. The cub extended its nose toward Lily, sniffing curiously, and Lily giggled softly but didn't move. Then, as if making a decision, the cub turned and walked toward the open door. It paused at the threshold, looking back one more time, and then disappeared into the rain-soaked afternoon. The family stood in silence for a moment, processing what had just happened, before Lily stood up and ran to her parents, chattering excitedly about the baby bear. But the story was far from over. As Ethan moved to close the back door, he saw something that made his blood run cold and then warm again in the space of a heartbeat. There, at the edge of the forest, barely visible through the rain, stood a full-grown bear. The mother, he realized, had been there all along, waiting for her cub. She was massive, probably 300 pounds of muscle and maternal instinct, and she was looking directly at him. For a moment that stretched like pulled taffy, their eyes met across the distance, and Ethan felt something pass between them that he would never be able to adequately describe. The mother bear made no move toward the shop, showed no sign of aggression. She simply stood there as her cub ran to her, the little one bounding through the puddles with obvious relief. The cub pressed against its mother's legs, and she lowered her great head to sniff and inspect her baby, checking for injuries. Satisfied that the cub was unharmed, she looked back at the storage room door where Ethan still stood, and in that look was something that might have been gratitude, or at least acknowledgement. Then she turned and melted back into the forest, her cub following close behind, and they were gone, as if they had never been there at all. Inside the storage room, Jessica was holding Lily close, her face a mixture of relief and amazement. Lily was still chattering about the baby bear, her words tumbling over each other in her excitement. She kept saying something that sounded like baby bear hungry and Lily help, her limited vocabulary struggling to contain the magnitude of her experience. Ethan closed the door and turned to his family, feeling like they had just been part of something larger than themselves, something that connected them to the wild world that existed just beyond their everyday lives. They moved back into the main shop, the familiar surroundings somehow different now, charged with the energy of what had just occurred. Jessica set Lily down, and she immediately ran to her collection of stuffed animals in the corner, selecting her favorite bear and hugging it tight. She brought it to her parents, pointing at it and then at the door, making sure they understood the connection. The innocence of her joy was infectious, and soon all three of them were laughing, the tension of the past half hour dissolving into something lighter. As the afternoon wore on and customers began to trickle in despite the rain, Ethan and Jessica took turns telling the story, though most people seemed skeptical. A bear cub in the bike shop? It sounded like something out of a children's book, too fantastic to be real. But Lily knew it was real, and she spent the rest of the day playing with her toy bear, feeding it pretend sandwiches and carefully moving imaginary boxes to free it from various predicaments. Her game was so earnest and detailed that even the doubting customers found themselves charmed by her conviction. That evening, after the shop had closed and they were eating dinner in their small apartment above the store, the rain finally stopped. The sudden silence was almost startling after 3 days of constant drumming, and through the window they could see breaks in the clouds where stars were beginning to appear. Lily was already sleepy, her adventure having worn her out, but she insisted on standing at the window for a few minutes, looking out at the dark forest that bordered their property. Jessica stood with her, holding her small hand, and together they watched and wondered if, somewhere out there, a mother bear was tucking her cub in for the night. Ethan found himself thinking about the whole experience as he cleaned up the storage room later that evening. He patched the broken window with a piece of plywood, making a mental note to get it properly fixed in the morning. As he stacked the boxes back in their proper places, he noticed something on the floor where the cub had been trapped. It was a small tuft of dark fur, caught on a splinter of wood. He picked it up carefully, turning it over in his fingers, feeling its softness. On impulse, he pocketed it, thinking that someday, when Lily was older, he would show it to her as proof that her magical afternoon with the bear cub had really happened. The next morning brought sunshine and a world washed clean by the rain. The bike shop opened as usual, and life continued in its familiar rhythm. But something had changed for the Marshall family. They found themselves looking at the forest edge more often, wondering about the bears that lived there. Lily would occasionally stop playing and look toward the storage room door, as if expecting to see her friend again. And sometimes, on very quiet mornings, Ethan thought he could see tracks in the mud at the forest edge, suggesting that perhaps the bears remembered them too. A week passed, then two, and the story of the bear cub became part of the family's mythology, told and retold until even they weren't sure of all the details anymore. Had the cub really taken the sandwich from Lily's hand, or had she placed it on the floor? Had the mother bear really looked at Ethan with understanding, or had he imagined that connection? The facts became less important than the feeling of the story, the sense that for one afternoon, the boundary between the human world and the wild world had become permeable, allowing for a moment of pure understanding. It was 3 weeks later when the second encounter occurred, though encounter might be too strong a word for what happened. Ethan was opening the shop early on a Saturday morning, the sun just beginning to paint the mountains gold when he saw them. The mother bear and her cub were at the forest edge, just visible through the morning mist. They weren't coming toward the shop, weren't even looking in that direction, just passing through on their way to somewhere else. But as Ethan watched, the cub stopped and turned toward the bike shop, standing on its hind legs for a better view. For just a moment, Ethan could have sworn the cub was looking directly at him, remembering perhaps the warm, dry storage room and the taste of peanut butter sandwich. Then the mother made a soft sound, and the cub dropped back to all fours and followed her into the forest. Ethan stood there for a long time after they had gone, holding his coffee and thinking about the strange threads that connect all living things. When Lily woke up an hour later, he told her that he had seen her bear friend, and her face lit up with such pure joy that it made his heart ache with love. The story could have ended there, a perfect little tale of childhood innocence and interspecies connection. But life has a way of adding postscripts to our stories, little additions that deepen their meaning. It was a month after the cub incident when Jessica discovered she was pregnant with their second child. As she stood in the bathroom holding the test, she found herself thinking about that afternoon in the storage room, about the fierce protectiveness of the mother bear and the innocent trust of the cub. She thought about how Lily had known instinctively what to do, how to help without harming, how to show compassion without fear. When she told Ethan that evening after Lily had gone to bed, they sat together on the couch and talked about the future. They talked about how they would tell Lily she was going to be a big sister, how they would manage the shop with a new baby, all the practical concerns that come with expanding a family. But underlying all of that was the memory of that rainy afternoon. The reminder that life is full of unexpected visitors and that sometimes the best response to the unknown is not fear, but kindness. Lily took the news of her impending siblinghood with the same matter-of-fact acceptance she had shown the bear cub. She immediately began making plans to share her toys and teach the baby important things, like how to properly feed stuffed animals and the correct way to move boxes if someone was trapped. She asked if the baby would be fuzzy like the bear cub, which made her parents laugh, and then very seriously asked if the bears could come visit when the baby was born. The innocence of the question was touching, but it also spoke to how the experience had shaped her understanding of family and community. As Jessica's pregnancy progressed through the summer and into fall, the story of the bear cub became a touchstone for the family. Whenever they faced a challenge or uncertainty, One of them would inevitably reference that afternoon, drawing strength from the reminder that sometimes the universe sends us exactly what we need, even if it comes in unexpected forms. The bike shop customers had heard the story so many times that it had become part of the local lore, embellished with each telling until some versions had Lily riding the cub around the storage room like a pony. The truth was both simpler and more profound than any of the embellished versions. It was about recognition, about seeing ourselves in the other, about the courage to help despite our fears. It was about a 2-year-old girl who saw a scared baby and responded with the only thing she had to offer: a half-eaten peanut butter sandwich and a compassionate presence. It was about parents who chose to trust their child's instincts rather than their own fears. And it was about a mother bear who waited patiently in the rain, trusting that her cub would find its way back to her. On a crisp October morning, with the leaves turning gold and red on the mountains, Jessica gave birth to their son. They named him Logan, and when they brought him home from the hospital, Lily was waiting with her bear's stuffed animal, ready to introduce her new brother to the important members of the household. She told Logan, in her serious 3-year-old voice, about the baby bear and how they had helped it, and how someday maybe they would see it again. The baby, of course, just slept through the story. But Lily didn't mind. She had plenty of time to teach him all the important things. That winter was harsh, with deep snow that kept customers away from the bike shop for days at a time. Ethan and Jessica took turns managing the store and caring for the children, finding a rhythm in their new life as a family of 4. On the quiet afternoons when snow fell steadily outside the windows, Lily would sometimes stand at the storage room door, remembering. She no longer expected to find a bear cub there, but the memory of that afternoon had become part of her understanding of the world, a foundation stone in her developing sense of how things should be. One snowy evening, as Ethan was closing up the shop, he heard a sound outside the back door of the storage room. His first thought was that it was just wind or maybe snow sliding off the roof, but something made him go check. When he opened the door, he found tracks in the snow, large and small, leading from the forest to the door and back again. There was nothing else, no other sign of visitors, but Ethan knew what those tracks meant. The bears remembered, and in their own way, they had come to check on the humans who had helped them. He didn't tell Jessica and Lily about the tracks right away, wanting to hold the secret close for a little while, to turn it over in his mind like a smooth stone. When he finally did tell them, over hot chocolate the next evening, Lily's eyes grew wide with wonder. She wanted to go out immediately and look for the bears, but Jessica gently explained that the bears needed their privacy, their wild space. The tracks were enough, a sign that the connection made that rainy afternoon continued to exist, even if they never saw the bears again. Spring came slowly to the mountains that year, with false starts and late snows that kept everyone guessing. But finally, the sun won its battle with winter, and the world began to green again. The bike shop grew busy with customers preparing for the riding season, and life took on the hectic pace of a small business in a tourist town. Logan was crawling by then, following Lily around with the determination of a little brother who didn't want to miss anything. Lily had appointed herself his protector and teacher, showing him all the important places in the shop and telling him stories he was too young to understand. It was on a busy Saturday in May, with customers browsing and Ethan helping someone pick out a new mountain bike, that it happened again. Lily was playing with Logan in the corner where they kept the toys when she suddenly stood up and pointed out the window. There, crossing the parking lot, bold as brass, was a young bear. Not a tiny cub anymore, but not fully grown either, an adolescent making its way in the world. It paused near the shop window, and for just a moment, Lily and the bear looked at each other through the glass. The customers in the shop froze, unsure whether to be frightened or amazed. But Lily just smiled and waved, as if greeting an old friend. The bear tilted its head, seeming to consider this small human who showed no fear, and then continued on its way, disappearing into the forest on the other side of the road. The whole encounter lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it left everyone in the shop feeling like they had witnessed something special. Lily turned to the amazed customers and announced matter-of-factly that that was her friend, the baby bear from the storage room, all grown up now. Whether it was really the same bear or not, no one could say for certain. Bears all look similar to human eyes, and the mountains were full of them. But Lily was convinced, and her conviction was contagious. The customers left the shop that day with a story to tell about a little girl and a bear who knew each other, who had shared a moment of connection that transcended species. The story spread through the town and beyond, growing and changing with each telling, but always maintaining its core of wonder. For the Marshall family, these encounters with the bears had become more than just unusual events. They had become reminders of the thin places in the world, where the boundaries between wild and domestic, between human and animal, become permeable. They were reminders that compassion doesn't require words, that help can be offered across any divide, and that sometimes the most profound connections are the ones we least expect. The storage room where the cub had been trapped became a sort of shrine to the experience, though nothing about it had changed except the family's awareness of what had happened there. As summer deepened and the tourists filled the town, life became too busy for much reflection. But in the quiet moments, early in the morning or late at night, Ethan and Jessica would sometimes talk about the bears and what they had meant to their family. They talked about how Lily had been changed by the experience, how she approached all animals with a combination of respect and fearlessness that was remarkable in such a young child. They talked about how they had been changed too, made more aware of the wild world that existed alongside their civilized one. Logan grew rapidly that summer, pulling himself up on furniture and taking his first tentative steps. Lily was there for each milestone, cheering him on and telling him stories about bears and bikes and the importance of helping others. She had created an elaborate mythology around the bear encounters, complete with names for the bears and adventures they went on when humans weren't watching. Logan listened with the rapt attention of a younger sibling, absorbing not just the stories, but the values embedded in them. It was August when the final chapter of the bear story wrote itself, though, of course, no one knew it was final at the time. The family had closed the shop early on a Sunday and gone for a picnic by the river that ran through town. It was one of those perfect summer days that makes people move to mountain towns, with clear blue skies and a gentle breeze that kept the heat from becoming oppressive. They had spread their blanket on the grass near the water, and Lily was showing Logan how to skip stones, though at his age it was more like throwing rocks with enthusiasm. They heard the bears before they saw them, a rustling in the bushes across the river that made everyone look up. There were 3 of them, a mother and 2 cubs, one larger than the other. They emerged from the forest and made their way to the river's edge, apparently unaware of or unconcerned by the human family watching from the other bank. The mother bear waded into the shallow water while the cubs played on the shore, wrestling and tumbling over each other with the pure joy of young creatures at play. Lily stood perfectly still, holding Logan's hand, watching with an intensity that made her parents hold their breath. The larger of the 2 cubs looked across the water, and for a moment that seemed to stretch like afternoon shadows, it and Lily regarded each other. There was no fear on either side, just a calm recognition, an acknowledgement of shared space and mutual respect. Then the mother bear made a soft sound, and the cubs followed her back into the forest, leaving only ripples in the water to show they had been there. The family sat in silence for a while after the bears had gone, each processing the encounter in their own way. Finally, Lily spoke, her voice soft but certain. She said the bears were okay, that they were happy and together, and that was all that mattered. The simple wisdom of her words struck Ethan and Jessica deeply. Their daughter had learned something profound from her encounters with the bears, something about the importance of family, about helping others without expecting anything in return, about coexisting with the wild world rather than trying to dominate it. As they packed up their picnic and headed home, Logan fell asleep in his father's arms, worn out from the excitement of the day. Lily walked between her parents, holding their hands, occasionally skipping but mostly just walking with the satisfied air of someone who has seen something wonderful. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. The town was quiet, most of the tourists having retreated to their hotels and vacation rentals, leaving the streets to the locals who knew how to appreciate the peace. Back at the bike shop, as they climbed the stairs to their apartment, Ethan noticed something tucked into the corner of the back door, something that hadn't been there when they left. It was a large pine cone, perfectly formed and placed deliberately, not blown there by wind or dropped by accident. He picked it up and showed it to Jessica, who smiled and shook her head in wonder. They both knew it was probably just coincidence, that pine cones fell from trees all the time. But the placement was so perfect, so deliberate-looking, that it was hard not to see it as a gift. Lily, of course, had no doubts. She took the pine cone and placed it carefully on the shelf in her room, next to the stuffed bear that had been her constant companion since that day in the storage room. She told Logan, who was too sleepy to really listen, that the bears had left it for them, a thank you for the help and the sandwich, and for not being afraid. Her parents didn't correct her. Because who were they to say she was wrong? The world was full of mysteries, and sometimes the most beautiful ones were the ones you chose to believe. As autumn approached and the leaves began their annual transformation, the Marshall family settled into their expanded life. The bear encounters became part of their family story, told and retold until they took on the quality of myth. But unlike myths, which grow more fantastic with each telling, their bear story somehow became simpler, more essential. It became less about the extraordinary nature of finding a bear cub in their storage room and more about the ordinary miracle of compassion, the simple act of helping another creature in need. Logan grew old enough to understand the stories, to point excitedly at every dog or cat they passed and shout, "Bear," which always made Lily laugh. She would correct him gently, explaining the difference between bears and other animals, but she never discouraged his enthusiasm. She was already teaching him what she had learned that day in the storage room, that the world was full of creatures who might need help, and that being small didn't mean you couldn't make a difference. The bike shop continued to thrive, becoming known not just for its quality service and good selection, but for being the place where the bear cub was rescued. Tourists would come in asking about the story, and Ethan or Jessica would tell it simply without embellishment, because the truth was remarkable enough. Sometimes Lily would add her own details about how soft the cub's fur looked, or how its eyes were sad but not mean, and these additions became part of the official version because they carried the emotional truth of the experience. Winter returned to the mountains with its familiar pattern of snow and silence, of shortened days and lengthened nights. The bears were hibernating now, tucked away in dens deep in the forest, dreaming whatever dreams bears dream. Lily would sometimes talk about them at bedtime, wondering if the cub remembered the warm storage room and the taste of peanut butter. She would make up stories about what the bears were dreaming, elaborate tales that usually involved bicycles and sandwiches, and families staying together no matter what. On particularly snowy nights, when the wind howled around the corners of the building and the bike shop below was dark and quiet, Ethan would sometimes go down and stand in the storage room. He would look at the corner where they had found the cub, now neatly organized with boxes of inventory, and marvel at how a single afternoon could change so much. The cub had been in their lives for less than an hour, but the ripples of that encounter continued to spread, affecting how they saw the world and their place in it. Jessica, for her part, found herself thinking about the mother bear often, especially as she watched her own children grow. The patience of waiting in the rain, the trust that her cub would be returned safely, the dignity of that final look of acknowledgement. These things resonated with her own experience of motherhood. She understood now that parenting, whether bear or human, involved a constant balance of protection and release, of keeping safe and letting go. The mother bear had trusted them with her most precious possession, and they had proven worthy of that trust. Spring came again, as it always does, with mud and melt and the gradual return of green to the world. The bikes came out of storage, the tourists returned, and life resumed its seasonal rhythm. But now, 2 years after the original encounter, the bear story had become less prominent in daily conversation. It was still there, like a foundation stone, but other stories had been built on top of it. Logan had learned to ride a tricycle, careening around the shop with a fearlessness that made his parents nervous. Lily had started preschool and was learning to write, her first stories invariably featuring bears and brave little girls. It was on an ordinary Tuesday in April, nothing special about the day except that the sun was shining after a week of rain, that Lily made an announcement at breakfast. She said she didn't need to see the bears anymore, that she knew they were okay. When Jessica asked her how she knew, she simply said she could feel it, the way she could feel that Logan was her brother even when he was at daycare, the way she knew her parents loved her even when they were busy with customers. The connection, she explained with the profound simplicity of a 4-year-old, didn't need to be seen to be real. This wisdom from their daughter left Ethan and Jessica speechless. They had spent so much time looking for the bears, hoping for another encounter, that they hadn't realized the encounters weren't the point. The point was the connection, the understanding that they shared the world with wild creatures who had their own lives and needs and families. The point was the compassion that had driven Lily to offer her sandwich, the courage that had let Ethan free the cub, the patience that had let Jessica trust the process. The bears had taught them all of this without meaning to, simply by being themselves. That summer passed peacefully, with no bear sightings except the occasional distant glimpse of a dark shape moving through the forest. The bike shop was busier than ever, and Ethan hired a part-time employee to help with the rush. Life was full and good, with the usual challenges of running a business and raising young children, but underneath it all was a sense of rightness, of being exactly where they were supposed to be. The storage room had been reorganized to prevent any future animal visitors, and the window properly fixed and reinforced, but sometimes Ethan would find Lily standing in there, just remembering. By the time autumn arrived again, the bear story had evolved into something more than memory. It had become a parable that the family used to navigate difficult decisions. When Lily was afraid to start kindergarten, Jessica reminded her of how brave she had been with the bear cub. When Logan fell off his tricycle and wanted to give up, Ethan told him about how the cub had kept trying to escape even when it seemed impossible. The story became a tool for teaching resilience, compassion, and courage, its lessons applicable to situations the bears could never have imagined. One evening in October, as the family was having dinner, Lily asked a question that surprised everyone. She wanted to know if the bears told stories about them, if somewhere in the forest a mother bear was telling her cubs about the humans who had helped them. It was such a beautiful thought that no one wanted to dismiss it. Ethan said he thought they probably did, that maybe bears had their own way of passing down important stories. Jessica added that maybe the story helped young bears understand that not all humans were dangerous, that some could be trusted. Logan, now talking in full sentences, declared that he would be nice to bears too, which made everyone smile. The truth was, none of them would ever know what the bears thought or remembered about that rainy afternoon in the storage room. But in a way, that uncertainty was part of the beauty of the story. It left room for wonder, for possibility, for the kind of magic that exists in the spaces between what we know and what we imagine. The bears had given them that gift, a story that would grow and change with their family, adapting to new situations while maintaining its core message of compassion and connection. As winter approached once more, bringing with it the promise of snow and quiet, the Marshall family prepared for the seasonal slowdown. They had learned to appreciate these quieter months when the shop was less busy and they had more time together. Lily was teaching Logan to play board games, though he was still young enough that the rules were more like suggestions. Jessica was pregnant again, another surprise addition to their growing family. And Ethan was planning an expansion of the shop, hoping to add a small cafe where cyclists could stop for coffee and stories. The bears were out there somewhere, preparing for hibernation, fattening up on berries and fish and whatever else bears eat to sustain them through the long sleep. The mother bear would be teaching her cubs, now almost fully grown, the final lessons they needed before setting off on their own. And perhaps, in whatever way bears remember things, she would recall the dry warmth of a storage room and the small human who had shared food with her frightened cub. Or perhaps not. Perhaps for the bears it was just another day in a life full of days, noteworthy only for its successful conclusion. But for the Marshall family it had been everything. It had been the moment that taught them about the porousness of boundaries, about the possibility of connection across difference, about the power of simple kindness. It had shown them that their daughter possessed a wisdom beyond her years, an instinctive understanding of how to be in the world with grace and compassion. It had reminded them that they were part of something larger than their small town and their bike shop, part of an ecosystem that included creatures wild and domestic, all trying to survive and thrive in their own ways. 2 chapters of mentioned part has completed. As the first snow of winter began to fall, dusting the mountains with white and transforming the world into something quieter and more mysterious, Lily stood at her bedroom window with Logan beside her. They watched the snowflakes drift down, each one unique and perfect in its own way. Lily told Logan that the bears were sleeping now, cozy in their dens, dreaming of spring and salmon and sunshine. Logan asked if they dreamed of peanut butter sandwiches too, and Lily considered this seriously before saying yes. She thought they probably did. Downstairs, Ethan was closing up the shop, turning off lights and checking locks, his routine so familiar he could do it without thinking. But when he got to the storage room, he paused, as he always did, and remembered. The corner where the cub had been trapped was now stacked with new inventory, boxes of helmets and cycling gloves waiting to be unpacked. But in his mind's eye, he could still see that frightened little creature, and his brave daughter offering comfort without fear. The memory made him smile, and he whispered a quiet thank you to the universe for bringing the bears into their lives. Jessica was in the apartment, preparing bedtime snacks and thinking about the new baby growing inside her. She wondered what stories this child would grow up hearing, what adventures would shape their understanding of the world. The bear's story would be part of it, of course, but there would be new stories too. because life was constantly offering opportunities for wonder if you were paying attention. She felt the baby move, a gentle flutter that reminded her of the cub's frightened breathing that day in the storage room, and she placed her hand on her belly, making her own quiet promise to teach this child about kindness. As the family gathered for their bedtime ritual, stories and songs and whispered goodnights, the snow continued to fall outside. Somewhere in the forest, bears slept deeply in their dens, their heartbeats slowed to almost nothing, trusting in the ancient rhythm of seasons to wake them when the time was right. And in the apartment above the bike shop, a family that had been touched by wildness settled in for their own night's rest, carrying within them the knowledge that the world was full of unexpected connections, waiting to be discovered. The story of the bear cub in the bike shop would be told for years to come, growing and changing with each telling but always maintaining its essential truth. That compassion transcends species, that helping others is always the right choice, and that sometimes the most profound experiences come in the most unexpected packages. It would become part of the town's folklore, part of the family's mythology, part of the invisible threads that connect all living things in the great web of existence. But more than that, it would continue to live in the actions of those who had been there that day, in Lily's fearless kindness toward all creatures, in Logan's enthusiastic curiosity about the world, in the new baby who would grow up knowing that bears were friends, not monsters, in Ethan and Jessica's deeper appreciation for the wild world that existed alongside their domestic one. The bears had given them all a gift that day, though they would never know it, the gift of seeing the world as interconnected, as full of potential for unexpected grace. Years later, when Lily was grown and had children of her own, she would tell them about the day she found a bear cub in Grandpa's bike shop. She would describe the fear in its eyes that transformed into trust, the weight of responsibility she felt to help, the joy of watching it reunite with its mother. And her children would listen with wide eyes, absorbing not just the story but the values embedded within it. They would learn that the world was not divided into us and them, but was instead a complex web of relationships waiting to be honored. Logan would become a wildlife biologist, spending his life studying and protecting the creatures that shared the mountain ecosystem. He would often think of that bear cub when he was out in the field, remembering how his sister's simple act of kindness had shaped his understanding of human-wildlife interaction. He would teach others that coexistence was possible, that fear could be replaced with respect, that every creature had its own story and its own right to exist. The bear cub he barely remembered would influence countless conservation decisions, its impact rippling out in ways no one could have predicted. The third child, the one Jessica was carrying that winter, would grow up with the bear story as a foundational myth, something that had always been true in their family's universe. They would become an artist, painting scenes of humans and animals in harmony, their work influenced by a story they hadn't lived but had absorbed through countless retellings. Their paintings would hang in galleries and homes, spreading the message of connection and compassion to people who had never heard of the little bike shop in the mountains where it all began. Ethan and Jessica would grow old in that town, running their bike shop and raising their children with the values the bears had helped them discover. They would become known as the Bear family, not because they kept bears or studied bears, but because they had been changed by bears in a fundamental way. When young parents came to them for advice, worried about their children's safety in a world that seemed increasingly dangerous, they would tell the story of Lily and the cub, emphasizing that teaching children compassion was just as important as teaching them caution. The bike shop itself would become a kind of pilgrimage site for people who had heard the story. They would come from far away, hoping to see the storage room, to understand how such a simple space could have hosted such a profound encounter. Ethan would show them around, pointing out the corner where the cub had been trapped, the window it had entered through, the door it had exited from. But he would always emphasize that the magic wasn't in the place, but in the response, in the choice to help rather than harm, to trust rather than fear. And what of the bears? They continued their wild lives, raising cubs and foraging for food, hibernating through winters and emerging into spring, completely unaware of their impact on the human family that had briefly intersected with their world. Or perhaps not completely unaware. Perhaps there was some deep animal memory that made them avoid the traps that other bears fell into, some inherited caution that kept them safer. Perhaps the mother bear taught her cubs to be wary but not afraid of humans, to evaluate each situation rather than react from instinct alone. The truth was that the bear's story and the human story had touched for just a moment, like two circles briefly overlapping before continuing on their separate paths. But in that moment of overlap, something magical had happened. A bridge had been built between worlds, a bridge made of nothing more substantial than a child's compassion and a parent's trust. It was a fragile bridge, one that could easily be destroyed by fear or misunderstanding. But as long as the story was told, as long as people remembered, the bridge would remain. On winter nights, when the snow fell heavy and the world seemed to hold its breath, the Marshall family would sometimes gather in the living room and tell stories. The bear story was always among them, worn smooth by repetition but never losing its power to inspire wonder. They would remember the sound of the rain on the roof, the sight of the cubs' frightened eyes, the weight of the moment when they had to choose between safety and compassion. And they would marvel at how Lily, barely 2 years old, had known instinctively what to do. The children would ask questions, the same ones every time. Was the bear scary? Did it try to bite? Were you afraid? And the parents would answer honestly, yes, there was fear, but there was something stronger than fear. There was recognition, the understanding that the cub was just a baby, lost and afraid, needing help. There was the knowledge that they had the power to make things better or worse, and the responsibility that came with that power. There was love, not just for their own child, but for all young things trying to find their way in the world. As the years passed and the world changed around them, with technology advancing and the climate shifting and the town growing beyond recognition, the bear story remained constant. It became an anchor, a reminder of what really mattered. When developers wanted to clear-cut the forest behind the shop, the Marshall family led the opposition, invoking the bears and all the other creatures that called those woods home. When the town council debated ordinances about wildlife management, Lily, now a teenager, stood up and told the story of the cub, arguing for coexistence over elimination. The story had power because it was true, because it had happened to real people in a real place, because it showed that connection was possible even across the vast divide between species. It reminded people that the world was not just a resource to be exploited, but a community to be part of, that humans were not separate from nature but woven into it, that every action had consequences that rippled out in ways we might never fully understand. The bear cub, in its brief visit to the human world, had changed not just one family but an entire community's relationship with the wild.